Hi, my name is Carol Rizzolo, and this is a public service announcement about early voting. 39 states in the nation, along with the District of Columbia, already have some form of early voting in place, but not Connecticut. So we've invited the Secretary of State, Denise Merrill, to come and speak about why early voting matters, why it would help, and how many people it would help. At the moment, there are several bills in the Hartford legislature to make voting more convenient for people. That's the goal. People with illnesses, people with chronic illnesses, people who are elderly. There are so many people who have difficulty getting to the polls, not to mention people who don't have driver's licenses and can't get there. What we're trying to do is lift the restrictions to make voting easier any other day. So for example, at the moment, Connecticut Constitution has it that we can only vote in those 14 hours on the Tuesday of Election Day. It's really not easy. What about if there's lousy weather? What about if you are feeling worse and worse and you suddenly just feel terrible on that day? It would be really lovely if you, as somebody who might be disabled or might need a ride, or there are all sorts of reasons why you might just need to go a few days earlier to go and cast your vote in person. So it's not a question of voter fraud. What if you could go in person to your town clerk's office and cast your ballot there, but to do it on a weekend? Imagine all of the people who are hourly workers who may not have the time to be able to wait in lines for hours, as happened in November. How many different ways we could make voting easier. Voting is a right. It's important that we make it more convenient. So in a moment, we're going to move from my telling you about this to an hour-long presentation that our Secretary of State gave in Guilford yesterday. This is a wonderful presentation. It's really important that we all understand it and that Connecticut voters understand why early voting matters and how it would help really to get Connecticut towards universal suffrage, which ultimately, isn't that the goal? I mean, our democracy only works when everybody casts their vote. Okay, so I'm going to close out now, and we'll let this presentation begin with our Secretary of State, Denise Merrill. Thank you.
So you're making it all possible, and I really mean that. And you are the ones that are going to make it possible if we can get this constitutional amendment passed. It's terribly important right this minute. So, and I have to say about the Democracy Cup again, the 80%, almost 80% turnout is extremely unusual for midterm election. And by the way, it did happen all across the state. Yes. We had a record turnout everywhere. And I like to think it is because, to some degree, of the very progressive legislation we've passed in the last few years. We are leaders in Connecticut on voter registration. We now are doing voter registration at the DMV. It's been incredibly successful. About 60%, maybe almost 70% now of our new registrations are coming in at the DMV, which is really good news because it means people are like typing in their own information. We don't have nearly the mistakes we used to have on the list. So it's doing a lot of good things. You can change your address more frequently. So all that's great. We also have online voter registration now, which covers an awful lot of people, about 70%. Wonderful. And like I say, Connecticut has been a leader in a lot of this. We are going the opposite direction, as you may know, from many other states who are really trying to restrict voting. The latest incursions on voting have to be pretty much in places like North Carolina. I know some of you have followed what's going on down there, and Georgia, where they actually are taking literally hundreds of thousands of people off the voting lists in a way that violates federal law. We're very, very careful when we take someone's name off a list. But that has been a new wave of what I consider to be voter suppression, and I think it's very meaningful because the 2020 election is not far away. These things will make a difference. So now we come to the area where we are not leaders, and that is in the area of additional opportunities for people to vote. 40 states now have some day besides Tuesday that they're able to vote. We are not one of them. And it is very simply because there is a restriction in our state constitution. It's a very unusual clause in our state constitution that says you can vote only on that Tuesday. So that there are only 2 other states that have the same language, and they're both in New England. Not a surprise. And you know, it's an historic artifact, I guess I'd say. I would refer you to this month's Connecticut History magazine. I wrote a little article about how this got into the 1818 Constitution, or at least the first notions of it. It was originally actually a liberalization for soldiers coming back from the war to allow them to vote by absentee ballot. So there are 2 restrictions in our state constitution. One is only on Tuesday, and the other one is you can only get an absentee ballot if you have certain reasons. And like I say, that was originally intended as a liberalization. It has acted in reverse in the later years now. And we are one of a very few states, again, that have restrictions on getting an absentee ballot. And you have to be, the biggest one that everyone knows about is you have to say that you're going to be out of town all hours of voting on election day. Now, I will tell you that in the last couple of cycles, the number of people using absentee ballots in Connecticut has doubled.
Really?
Yeah, because I honestly think it's because people are figuring out that we don't have police that are going to go find out if you're actually in town. So probably, again, unsurprisingly, guess what town had the biggest number of absentee ballots in the state? No, actually, I mean, most people guess it's the cities, right? Because you hear about absentee ballots in cities. It actually was Greenwich. Yeah, and the second largest number was West Hartford. So I think, I don't know exactly what's going on, but I think that will continue despite the limitation in our law. So we're kind of making liars out of people, I feel. I know this crowd, you follow some of these issues, and I know you know also there are states in the West that are experimenting with vote by mail. So Oregon, Washington, Colorado, California now all vote by mail. Now this is a very foreign concept to those of us in New England because many of the things that allows are actually illegal here. And I always like to compare it to sort of the difference between a standard test where you go in and take a test and fill out the bubbles or whatever, and an open book test. Because in Oregon, for example, if you voted last cycle, you are mailed a ballot automatically. You fill it out. You can ask anybody you want to help you fill it out. You mail it back, and they have a signature comparison way. It's sort of like an absentee ballot, and that's how they vote. They have the highest voter turnout in the country. Routinely, 90% of people vote, and every time they survey the public, they love it. Now here, if you suggested some of this, people would be appalled. They'd say, oh my God, how can you allow other people to help you fill out your ballot? They don't seem to care about that. They don't seem to fret about whether it's voter fraud or any of that. And I think they have pretty good signature comparison computers, that programs that do the signature comparison. So I'm just pointing out there are many, many different versions of early voting, if you will, and that term has come to mean simply voting on different days besides Tuesday, as opposed to absentee balloting, where you're mailing in or not appearing in person. And it's an important distinction because recently several people who appear to be opposed to this, including Representative Candelora, have mentioned the fact that they are afraid that early voting will create more voter fraud. And I'm at a loss to explain his reasoning. Because you're still appearing in person. So let's talk a little bit about what the proposal is right now in Connecticut, this constitutional amendment. And I think it's the most important bill that you will see this year. I don't care what issue you care about, whether it's the environment, whether it's gun violence, it all rests on people being able to come out and vote for the candidate of their choice. And this last cycle, the good news was we had a huge turnout. The bad news was we had long, long lines in many places in the state. The worst, of course, was New Haven. New Haven was chaos on election day because they simply did not staff up for election day registration or even out in the polling places. And this happened in at least 20 to 25 towns in the state that we know of, because it doesn't necessarily get reported to us unless an average citizen calls in and is outraged that they have to stand in line for an hour. This, to me, is tantamount to denying someone their right to vote. It's completely unacceptable, especially in Connecticut, where we have routinely had such great elections. We are rated very highly in the country for our election process. So I'm deeply disturbed by this, this trend, which is now starting, I think, partially because towns are cutting back on some of their expenses. Some of them are collapsing polling places. They're not providing enough staff, and it is beginning to show. So this is one big reason that I think we need to consider other options for people. First of all, there's a lot of people who just can't make it on Tuesday. It's a work day. People have childcare issues. Older people maybe can't make it on precisely that day, you know, as we were discussing before. So, and the reasons we had it on a Tuesday are sort of lost in the mists of time, right? I mean, why Tuesday? It may have made sense at one time in our history, but I don't think it does anymore. So, so the idea that you'd have more days to vote is simply a way that I like to think of as turning our elections system on its head. Because we need to be considering the voters here, not just the election officials or the candidates or the parties. This is about giving people their right to vote. And that's what we should be considering when we put together a system that works for everyone. And that's what we're trying to do here. So, if we have more days of voting, clearly there are going to be more opportunities. And that will have to get sorted out, whether it's a weekend day, whether it's 3 days or 10 days. You see states like Texas where they have 30 days of voting. I'm not sure we want to go there, but you know, it at least allows us to explore the full range of possibilities. But the first step is the constitutional amendment, because we have to take the restrictive language out of the state constitution and put it in statute where it belongs, as all other laws belong, because the state constitution should not be a cookbook. It should be a policy statement, higher level than exactly what day. So I will fight very hard for my particular version of the constitutional amendment, which simply takes the language out and puts it in statute. Other versions, people are trying to say, well, no more than 5 days, or you know, maybe a certain number of days. I think that belongs in statute and not in the Constitution. But I think some people think maybe it'll pass more easily if it's more restrictive and more specific about exactly how many days. And this is where we all kind of get hung up starting to talk about, well, is it going to be 5 days? Is it going to be a weekend? Oh, if it's a Saturday, then doesn't it have to also be a Sunday? How many days in advance? What if people want their ballot back, you know, if it's too long in advance? We can sort that all out later. I can tell you my favorite version of what we would do, which takes a lot of this into consideration. For me, it would be probably 4 days of early voting, hopefully at least 1 day on a weekend, the weekend before the Tuesday, and several days during the week where you'd only open town hall. See, this is another thing. You don't have to open all 40 polling places or whatever it is in New Haven. You can just do it at City Hall, because not everybody's going to come in at once. So that sort of addresses the cost concern, which I've also heard. Oh, if we have more days of voting, it's going to cost more money. No, not necessarily. For example, in Florida, they have 10 days of early voting. The voting goes on only at town hall and libraries because they're already open, so they don't have to provide more staff. And they do not vote on a weekend, probably for that reason. So I personally think a weekend, a day of voting is warranted. I think that would enable a lot of people to come in. I also think we need to be able to have what we call a permanent disability list. We have one now, it's probably unconstitutional, but right now, if you have a permanent disability, which means you cannot get to the polls at all, you can request to be on a list at Town Hall, and they will automatically mail you an absentee ballot. That should be expanded, and if we get this language out of the Constitution and in statute, that can also occur. So my constitutional amendment also, so it has two provisions. One is at least 3 days of early voting. That's to prevent it from getting collapsed down too much. You know, you can allow it and then it still wouldn't happen otherwise. So I want at least 3 days of early voting. And it also takes the restrictions off of the absentee ballot language. That's also in the state constitution. It's also in statute right now. So just passing this constitutional amendment would mean that part is still in statute and would have to be changed. The part about how you have to be out of town, that would all still have to be changed in statute. But at least we would have the flexibility then to change with the times, whatever that turns out to be. And I fully anticipate this will keep changing. You know, young people are wondering why we can't vote online. Well, so far, for my money, I would not do that right now in particular, because these threats from foreign countries and other bad actors are very real. I can tell you that because I now have security clearance and attend meetings routinely in Washington with the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and other agencies, and they have confirmed very clearly that Connecticut definitely was a state that was, there was an attempt to enter many of our systems. A lot of these attempts are at the local level. They come in through phishing emails and other ways of getting in, and they have documented all this. So this is nothing manufactured. This is not fake news. This is very real, and so, you know, those are the considerations I'm looking at. But nonetheless, times will change, and I certainly see a time when that may be different. So I would argue for the most flexibility, pass the constitutional amendment, and put the language in statute. So let me just explain exactly how that works. So if we will have a bill. By the way, this bill does not have a number yet. Interestingly, you're going to see a whole lot of bills about early voting, absentee balloting, and that's actually good news. There's a Senate bill that's been introduced by Marty Looney, head of the Senate, which means, you know, obviously strong support for early voting from that quarter. Several Republicans have introduced bills on early voting in the House. I don't think so in the Senate. I do have some Republican support. It's spotty. For a constitutional amendment to pass, you can either do, you know, you get 51% of the vote, both House and Senate. No need for a governor's signature, but I'm sure the governor is firmly in support of early voting. And so then it would proceed, if you get only 51%, it has to go to another legislature. So that means not even just next year, but another group that gets elected in 2020. Oh. It has to pass again by 51% in both House and Senate. And then it goes on the next statewide ballot. That means it doesn't actually get on the ballot till 2022. The other option is, if it passes by 75% in both houses, it goes on the ballot in 2020. So right now you can see 75% is a lot. So even with the strong Democratic majority in House and Senate, it's not enough. That's why I am so focused on trying to get more Republican votes to join us. This has not been a partisan issue in any other state where it's passed, which is fascinating. Now, most of them passed a while back, before things got this dreadfully partisan. And so that may explain it. But for example, in Vermont, the very same situation. The language was in their state constitution. They needed a constitutional amendment. It passed unanimously in both houses and went right on the ballot. And that was about 5 years ago. So I am kind of surprised, frankly, that this has become a somewhat partisan issue in Connecticut. And I say somewhat because there are those Republicans who have supported this and continue to support it. And then there are others that supported it before and are not supporting it now. I would put Len Fasano in that category, for example. And when he made a comment about it in the paper, and I have not spoken with him this year yet, he said something about it's going to create more voter fraud. And again, I don't understand that because this is really in-person voting on different days. So I don't see that opportunity for more fraud. He may be thinking about the absentee ballots. And frankly, this last week in North Carolina has made even me say, we've got to recognize fraud does happen with absentee ballots. There's much more opportunity, obviously, because the people are, you're not standing in front of someone, you're sending it by mail. And so, you know, with all due respect to my colleagues in Oregon, I think there is more opportunity for fraudulent misbehavior with absentee ballots. Nonetheless, it's still quite rare. And in-person ballot fraud is virtually non-existent. We have never had a case in Connecticut. So, you know, I don't know where that's coming from, but I will just tell you that is what I have heard, that there is some objection, and I think it's almost a knee-jerk reaction to any change in our voting procedures.
So the Republican
Okay, I'll
white
stop.
base is
No, you don't
shrinking.
need to stop at all.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
The Republican white base is shrinking, and by restricting the voter rolls, they have a better chance of staying in power.
Sam, you can-
Okay, the Republican white base is shrinking, and by restricting the voting rolls, and we've seen this in Georgia, fewer people vote and Republicans getting into office is a better possibility.
That's probably, I mean, I'm trying to stay away from making this partisan, but it's difficult, I'll be honest. I mean, I think you're right. There probably is some sense that more people voting is not good news for Republicans. But I would point you to the fact that we were just talking about how Greenwich has a large number of absentee ballots. That may explain why a lot of Republicans are in favor of liberalizing the absentee ballot laws, because, you know, they have a lot of people in Fairfield County who commute and are not able to get to the polls during the day. And so I think, you know, there historically has been more support in Fairfield County for absentee ballots. So it's interesting. I mean, of course, that's the problem with elections. Everybody who's at the legislature or anywhere in political office got there through the current system, and they have a big interest in how it works. And I think we have to turn that on its head. This should be about the voters. And it's what I call voter-centric. It should be voter-centric, not about the candidates. But that's tough, you know, because you have to get the vote of these people who've all gotten there with the current system. It's a holiday, I've supported that for years. I prefer if it were a federal holiday, and actually, H.R. 1, it's in there that Election Day would be a holiday, which it should be. I mean, personally, I think we ought to take one of the existing, how about Veterans Day? It's a week later. How about 4th of July? We're already celebrating. You know, there are other options, but until the federal holiday is declared, sure, let's make it a state holiday. My only objection to that is, of course, not everybody gets the state holiday. The people that are least able to vote are the ones that are probably not getting that day off. But it's a start, you know, and it's, there are other structural considerations. For example, we prefer that, you know, there are bills to change the date of the primary. The problem there is we would prefer the schools be closed, because ever since Sandy Hook, we've had real concerns about security in our schools. And so we can't really have a primary while school's in session. Most schools now close on Election Day. I don't know if they do in your towns. Yeah. Not all of them, though. So there are other kind of structural considerations for some of that. What do you add? Parolees, yes, I think they ought to be able to vote. Yeah, that's not even a question.
Might these additional measures come later? You just want
Oh, they'll probably, I think some of those will come up this year and will probably pass. I've made several of the same proposals, actually. I've included the parolees voting, and I have an election reform bill that will do some of those things as well. I'm also very concerned about what happened over in Hamden and in several other places where the redistricting was not done correctly, and it really created a problem later on. So I've made a proposal that we audit the redistricting maps after they are sent to our office. We don't have much of a role in redistricting. I wish I did, because I would change that too. But I would go the direction of California, where they have a nonpartisan commission that now does redistricting, and stop all the gerrymandering, which makes our elections a nightmare to administer, among other things, because it doesn't honor town lines. Towns are split into 7 or 8 pieces sometimes, so things like that. But the thing that happened with the redistricting maps is no one goes back to check to make sure they're done appropriately according to the maps. And so we got into problems in Hamden with that, and also over in Derby. And then of course we had the problem in Stratford, where they used the same tabulator for 2 different districts, which I thought was already not allowed, but it is apparently under our statute question mark as to whether it should have happened. But anyway, I don't know how much you follow what goes on, but there's been a big argument about who actually won in Stratford because they can't untangle who got the wrong ballots. What happened was they ran out of one kind of ballot. They were using 2 different ballots in the same tabulator for 2 different districts in the same room. Welcome to my world. And what happened was they ran out of one kind and somebody just grabbed the others and started giving them to people. But we have no way of knowing how many got the wrong ballots because they were using the same tabulator. So I've made a proposal that that no longer be allowed. And you know, there's a
Staffing plans.
staffing plans, yes. My biggest issue was long lines on election day and what happened in New Haven. And I think there are several solutions to that. I mean, the good news is we have election day registration. This has allowed literally tens of thousands of people to vote who would not have been able to otherwise. So it's a wonderful idea. It has to be executed properly. And what happened there was apparently they didn't have enough staff, they didn't have enough computers, and literally hundreds of Yale students showed up rather late in the day. But that shouldn't matter, you know? I mean, people have a right to vote. You've got to plan for those things. So yes, I've made a proposal that towns must submit a plan to our office 30 days in advance so we can help them manage for election day registration and other anomalies. We told them all this was going to be a big turnout. The registration was unbelievable. The highest number of people registered to vote for this election than we've ever seen, ever. 250,000 new voters in Connecticut. It was amazing. Right. And even more amazing, the number of 18 to 24-year-olds who usually in a 2-year period between 2016 and 2018, we'd get maybe 15,000. 92,000 young people registered to vote. Astonishing. And I don't think they're going away. I think they're coming back. And so we've got a plan.
Maureen, there you go.
I realize, can you be very clear about what this covers? So I understand statewide elections. When I get down to a town level, we have, town budget votes. We have local selectmen. Does the Constitution cover all of those elections? So all of them would have to have, say, 3-day voting, including our town budget?
No.
No.
Just statewide, general. Not primary even. General election only.
Do we have anybody else who has questions while we have this exquisitely, okay, there you go.
I just wanted
Oh,
to.
no, hold on a second, Susan. Susan, hold it.
I know that the Parkland students were very involved in getting young people to register, and I wondered if you had a feeling that maybe that made some difference.
Yes, I'd have to say I'm sure it did. I feel like this generation has come to life. really since 2016. And I saw it all over the state. You know, previously I was the state representative from Storrs, Connecticut, a little place up there called Yukon. And, you know, so I've watched this over the years, and I feel like there was kind of a long lull where it was very difficult to get students or, you know, young people involved. It was a lot of cynicism. And it's sort of like, the galvanizing events, I'm sure, are gun violence, for example, and the activities of the Parkland students showed that voices would be heard from this next generation. We're sort of starved for it, I think. I've waited for this all my life. You know, I'm one of those people that got involved as a young person in the 70s, and there were different issues at the time. It was the environment, it was the Vietnam War. I feel like this is this generation's moment, and they're gonna come out.
Does anybody else have any questions or any comments that they'd like to make? Sure, Rita.
What are we doing to keep the Russians out?
A lot, honestly. We just got I mean, first of all, I don't want people to panic too much about this because the only thing that we've actually observed so far are some, what they call pings, sort of like pinging our systems trying to get into the voter file. Now the voter file is public information, first of all, so it's not like they're trying to get secret information. And the notion that somehow they would get in and maybe take names off, put names on, mess around with the list, I think mostly is about a campaign of disinformation, which we Americans are very prone to believe these days. And from what I understand from the meetings I've been in, and I guess I can tell you this because some of this stuff is really, you know, I'm sworn to secrecy and all that. We're learning slowly over time what that really was about, and it's really about creating chaos in the American public. The campaign of disinformation, which is more the fake Facebook pages and the social media stuff, but also this knocking on the door of all the states' voter files and attempts to, you know, maybe change some of the technology. We've seen some of that, not in Connecticut, but the election management systems are all computerized now. So there have been attempts apparently to alter the results as they go up online. And what that does is it makes it looks like somebody won who didn't, for example, or that the votes are different and they do it early. Sort of like, you know, you get those AP results early and everybody panics, oh my gosh, so-and-so's winning, but then it turns out there's only 2% of the precincts in. It's that sort of thing, where they're creating, really in the American people, this suspicion about the election and about the results. And my deepest concern is that we will never have another uncontested presidential election in this country. And you see it already, that everyone will contest everything now because of the suspicion that's been created. I will tell you, I think our system has not only held, they haven't gotten in. And phishing emails have been turned back. And we are now, I got a $5 million grant from, $5 million from leftover Help America Vote funds that we are deploying to upgrade the local connections, which is really our biggest problem. We have 169 towns, some of which are pretty technological and some are not. And a lot of this is just, you know, people changing passwords. We have to do dual authentication now, the way you do on all your computers. And our systems are admittedly quite elderly. They're like 20 years old now. And we're patching it together, but it's not long before we're going to have new election tabulators, new election systems, and it will cost some money. So, but for now, I'm very happy with the way our elections are performing. We have a paper ballot, it's auditable, there's a paper trail, you're handling it yourself, there's nothing electronic, you're filling in the little bubble, we can trace it all back. So we're in fine shape compared with some other states that did buy the touch screens that have no auditable trail. And it's this, that we have to maintain the trust of the American people. That's the most important thing. So no matter what you're hearing, you know, we are making sure we're doing everything we can, and we're getting a lot of assistance from the Department of Homeland Security, quite honestly. in making sure our systems are, capable of turning back these attempts. So I'm very clear that right now, I'm feeling good about where we are. Doesn't mean something might not happen, but we have a lot of backup systems. We're backed up in the cloud, we're backed up on paper, we print the list every day now, the whole statewide list. So we've got paper, which is good, even in this day and age. So, hope that answers.
Is anybody else who has now thought of a question? No? Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you so much. I can't tell you how much I appreciate what you're doing.